Thank you, Sam, and welcome again to our committee podcast. Apologies, I have no camera today. I'm not sure the tech gremlins have got into my computer, so apologies, my camera won't be on. But everybody else's cameras is on, so that's good to see. Our podcasts are a series of conversations with Strata experts about how to build effective committees and also just what's new and happening in the industry. The focus of our conversations will be around contemporary issues and the human factors rather than legal requirements, though we may touch on some of the legal aspects that you may need to consider. In the first 6 episodes, we explored why people volunteer to be on a committee, their experience of joining a committee, what are the most important steps for a committee to do, and from day one, managing your manager. In the next 6 episodes, we explored with David Hamilton, give us a wave, David, how to prepare your building for electric vehicles and the right and the wrong way to go about it. To review the recordings from the past sessions and to get notifications of future events, you need to subscribe to SCA Inside Strata newsletter and head over to our www.vic.strata.community. Click on the Owners Corporation info and look for the Owners Vodcast tile. There you'll see all of the sessions that we've got. You can get the past recordings and any other information that we've uploaded with it. Today we welcome back 2 of our usual panel members. Catherine Leza, give us a wave, Catherine, to the conversation, and David Hamilton, who we mentioned earlier. Our panel members are lot owners, very involved with their committees and or their owners' corporations. Catherine has experience of multi-storey apartment living, many project improvements with a particular passion on sustainability, and has experienced at least 15 different strata managers in her journey. And likes to renovate, likes to do a lot of renovations. So she's very interested in this conversation, Warren, because I can see what's going to come at next. We're going to have a pop top on Catherine's building. And then we've got David.
Yeah, I tell you, I can't tell you how often I've thought about this.
And then we've got David Hamilton, who lives in a very high rise that I'm not sure a pop top is going to work on his building. But nonetheless, David has that experience and brings us the expert view of, well, a lot of all things building, but in particular electrification of our buildings and EV charging. And we do appreciate both your contributions continually in our podcast. But today we have a special guest, and that is Warren Livesey from the Association of Rooftop and Airspace Development and by Airspace, spreading the word to help strata owners unlock the value of the airspace above their building. Warren is very active on LinkedIn. It keeps me entertained continually. And the topics that you pick up are really wide and varied, Warren, and they're all very informative. And particularly in trends around prefab and lightweight construction, because obviously that fits with some of the pop tops that you're talking about, but also as a solution for sustainability and perhaps even affordable housing. So welcome to you all, and thank you for joining today. So Warren, just as a kickstart there, you mentioned housing affordability and housing shortage, and both of these are front page news and issues for us in Australia, and I think probably elsewhere, elsewhere in the world. Where does rooftop development fit in?
Oh, thank you, Julie. Look, it's a really exciting opportunity for any building owners that's ultimately needing to renovate or spend large capital amounts on their building to fix it, as well as be able to provide more housing for every other Australian. But ultimately, it's building modular homes on the rooftops of our existing strata buildings. And those funds are kind of paneled through into the sinking fund for the building to then use to fix it up, and also make good of any kind of communal areas, and even creating some green rooftops for apartment owners to.
Okay, Warren, you accidentally hit mute then.
Is that better?
Yep, that's great.
That's
Thanks.
great. Yeah,
Thanks.
so it's a really exciting. It's the fastest growing and greenest kind of urban infill housing development over the course of there's about 18 odd countries at the present moment. London is leading the charge. They've actually approved 180,000 airspace homes since 2020, and they've actually created an $86 billion industry in the last 4 years. So
Wow.
that amount of money is actually going to be used for the building owners there to actually fix up their building as well as provide new homes.
That's really interesting. Just touching on one point there, in connecting the sustainability comment that you made in terms of the construction and prefab, because there's some great work being done in the prefab space about the types of materials that are being used, etc. So I guess it's not only just, you know, filling a spot of putting accommodation there, it's actually being able to further that better environmental outcomes for the planet by also choosing particular types of construction as well. So you could take it to that length as well. We're not just talking about, you know, putting up the old hardy plank, the, you know, kind of idea, where we actually be quite deliberate about what we choose to put there.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's interesting. Another thing that was in the paper as well, The Age ran a story about converting empty office buildings into apartments, citing an audit report listing 86 buildings in Melbourne as really ripe for adaptive reuse. And I know David saw this report because he pointed it out to me as well. The report narrowed the buildings to those of 10 levels and constructed before 1990, because these buildings are more likely to have structural capacity to allow for the additional levels. Now, this structural capacity is one of our concerns. I'll say for those of our aging building stock, and particularly of building stock that had very poor quality of building standards to get there in the first place. Has a similar question to that sort of come up in the work that you're doing? I know there's lots happening overseas, but we're talking about here in Australia and our quality building standards. Has there been any kind of comparisons done in the space that you're aware of that links the ripe building for the residential? Because commercial is very different in terms of how it went up in the first place. So residential less so. Is there any research around that helps guide us on buildings that would be the low-hanging fruit to look at?
Yeah, so predominantly most of the buildings, New South Wales, also Victoria, built kind of the 1930s, 40s, 50s. These are double brick buildings. They generally needing some form of major works or capital works to be done to them in regards to brick ties going or corroding, concrete cancer and the like. So on average, on average, say 25% of the buildings, of the older buildings, can actually take the additional weight with any other structural works to be done to them. However, a majority of them do need capital works to be spent on them in order to actually take additional weight. The beauty, however, is most buildings can take at least another 6 to 12 tons on them, especially the older buildings that are kind of like the peak roofs that have concrete tiles. As soon as the concrete tiles are really heavy, so you're actually replacing it with a very lightweight construction on the top. It's all generally timber and cladding. So you're actually not actually adding that amount, but primarily, just to put it in everyone's perspective, we're looking at 1 to 2 levels maximum. I mean, that's pretty
Yeah.
much what happened in London, New York, as well as Canada, Singapore. So most buildings can take a little bit more without major structural work to be done to it, but not huge amounts of space. So what we're ultimately trying to do is just use the existing roof space area that's there for additional level and, if possible, 2.
So out of interest, I don't know if you know this or not, but would 10 levels also represent the crane lift? Like, you know, being aware that there are different size cranes, and some of those really big cranes, we have very few of them, you know, but
Yeah.
would that represent like the 10 was a sweet spot for crane lifting?
That would be more in the CBD area and commercial buildings. My huge focus has been on strata, ultimately, more in the kind of surrounding areas. Just in Melbourne, there's about 30 million square meters of unused roof space that we can actually use for new houses, opposed to using up any more land is ultimately the case. But yeah, the reason for modular makes a lot of sense. It's actually used cross-laminated timber. It's lighter than any other construction and actually takes carbon out of the atmosphere opposed to concrete that puts carbon into our atmosphere. So it actually creates a negative or a 0 to negative environmental effect by using these prefabricated modular homes. And obviously it makes the implementation of it down to a case of weeks opposed to months, because they literally are building it off-site, coming through and then crane lifting it on over a course of a number of days.
So effectively,
And Warren, there's a lot of there's usually, sorry, Julie, there's usually a lot of assets on the roofs. So there's usually plant rooms and water heaters and all kinds of stuff. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, so there's always a roof on top of a roof, if that makes any sense. So we'd just be relocating a lot of that equipment above where we are building. So, I mean, primarily we're looking at, 90,000 strata buildings just in New South Wales. I think it's less than that in Victoria. But most of those, about 50% of them are over 40 to 50 to 60 years of age, and they're not flat top, they're actually the peak roofs. And it's those ones that in the peak roof, it's empty void. And we don't need a peak roof. We don't have any snow on the actual coastline, which kind of why all these peak roofs were put in the first place. So what we're suggesting is to knock out all of these older rooftops that aren't of any use, that are leaking and have fire requirement updates. And we're saying instead of the OC having to pay for these fire upgrades, why don't you sell off the airspace to someone else? And I just wanted to recap here that the focus of overseas is that the airspace is tendered off to a group of airspace developers. That we're not suggesting that the OC take on the ability to do the development themselves. They go into a joint venture contract with a developer. The developer is the one that actually finances, does the project management and the application to council. So what I'm saying is kind of leaving it to the professionals so that the whole committee doesn't get bogged down with 17 different meetings and getting 75 in Victoria 100% voting all the time. It's actually at the very first step we sign the contracts and the addendums to allow us to actually go ahead and do the development. So making a standard development could take 10 years if the owners did it, but the developers can do it in 2 to 3 years.
So Julie, I have a quick question on that for Warren. And yes, I agree 100% with him that the sustainability benefits of using light construction methods and laminated timber as the structural elements is a far more sustainable outcome that should be pursued. It's much lower carbon footprint than using concrete. So, but the question I have, though, really relates to this last point, which is, in essence, you've got an owners corporation, and you're going to be adding to the owner to the strata adding more land, in the land tenure terms, you're adding more levels and into the strata, and thus there seems to be some interesting legal issues about how do you expand a strata that has been set in concrete, so to speak, from a legal perspective. So how do you go about at determining that, or does it create it as a separate strata in its own right? And then how do you integrate that? And apart from all the mechanical, electrical integration, I think the commercial that legal issue would be of great interest to people on this panel or watching this vodcast.
Thank you. Yeah, look, it's very easy to add an additional lot. What basically happens is in step one, we kind of identify the airspace as being of value. We get a town planner to confirm that we can build up. We get a structural engineer to say that the building can potentially take the additional weight. We then tender out that airspace to a group of airspace developers, similar to you would tender out to plumbing or any electrical works, I guess. And it's at that stage you actually are then negotiating a contract, an addendum, and signing up bylaws with the airspace developer so that they can actually go to the council and submit the application on their behalf, on the OC's behalf. It's once that space has been approved by council that due to the contract, initial contract, that allotment is then created. So then the actual owners, the airspace owners have the bylaws in place to actually start building in that particular area. Once that the space has been created, one gets a survey out that creates a new title application to the land environmental courts, and then we adjust the actual title deeds of the body corporate.
Right. So for some of us sitting in Victoria, so when it goes to the titles office to be registered as a title, and you've had a surveyor do this surveying, unlike a normal development, right? So you've got, the developer becomes the initial strata committee. You seem to have a really interesting intersection between, you've got a group of people who live in a building, who constitute an owners corporation, who've contracted with a party to build something, which then creates more lots and changes lot liabilities, lot entitlements. There seems to be quite an interesting amount of work that needs to be thought through. Well, explanation for people like me on a committee who, if you were considering going through this, which you really need to know right up front before you jump in.
Exactly, and we do explain this at the forefront. But ultimately, yes, you do have two ways. You can either create an additional lot, say there's 8 buildings, you can create a 9th lot, or you can do a stratum. Now, stratum is actually creating a whole new strata plan in the roof space. So what would happen there is you'd have the initial strata on the ground floor per se, the ground area. The new airspace could be an additional strata, and then you just have a building agreement contract between the two of access and creating all the connections with electricity, water, and rates. However, it's not recommended stratum. It's very very Canadian based. Here we prefer to add additional lots, but yes, we need to be mindful of educating people of how this can be achieved. But the real bonus of this is not just creating the rooftop being a environmentally friendly aspect. The fact is, presently we knock buildings down, and then we sell out to a developer, we knock them down, and then they build this big gigantic thing that has all the defects that we're having to deal with. The point is, we don't need to knock them down. So our point is actually providing a solution to the OC, instead of having to move out and move away from their communities and sell because they can't afford to fix their building. They can actually use the value of their airspace to fix the building and stay connected and stay living in their building.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a great upside for, as opposed to the downsides of somebody acquiring 70% of the lots and then compulsorily acquiring 100% of them and kicking everybody out. And I think that's a really great benefit. But I'm really being the devil's advocate, sort of as a committee member, as I would be, wanting to know. I think that would be where I'd be raising a whole lot of questions at the outset. So I think what you're saying to us does give us some insights into how to drive into, and for people who are on these calls and watching these podcasts, answering that pretty fundamental questions.
Julie, can I ask a question, please?
You can. I was just going to throw to you, Greg. So Greg's got a question.
Warren, yeah, Greg Honeyman. I'm in Ballarat, and apart from the fact that Ballarat is it's an investment city, in our portfolio of around about 1,500 lots, approximately 70% of those lots are investment units where they're tenanted. So that raises a particular question, which with interruption in owners' rental income, for instance, when work has to proceed. But the most basic fact is that for the last 20 years or so, Ballarat seems to have developed this process of building cookie cutter style owners corporations where they are timber frame, brick veneer, and the structural element of the building is timber, usually with a tiled roof or more recently lately with a colorbond roof. Is that sort of building going to be structurally sound enough to be able to carry the weight, the load of an additional building on top, and particularly where you've got a row, you know, conjoined buildings where you may have a set of 10 or 15, sometimes more units, which are conjoined?
Short answer is no. They can't take the structural integrity. What generally has to happen is that structural beams are having to put in, very similar to like a table. If you imagine a table, putting a table over the top of a building, you've got the 4 pillars that go down into the ground, and then the additional lot is built on that tabletop.
Yeah.
But what generally happens is of some of the older double brick strata blocks that have 2 sets of stairwells. Generally, the back one is normally used for fire. In the good old days, they don't actually need them; they become redundant. So what we're actually doing is we retrofitting lifts into the back stairwell to actually then service the top floor, as well as give access to each individual floor going up. So where we may have an aging population in 3, 4, 5-story buildings, we can actually give access to their level by doing these lifts. And these lifts can actually, the lift shafts anyway, create the structural integrity to take the weight of the additional rooftop development.
It's the same here in Ballarat because Ballarat is now growing geographically like Melbourne, with just constantly expanding to the extremes now. And what used to be the 10-minute city is rapidly becoming the 20-minute city, and God knows what it'll be like in another decade. So it's a fabulous idea, and it's something that Ballarat Council should be made aware of to make those recommendations. I mean, it's got to come from the council to make recommendations to developers to ensure that they create constructions that are capable of taking that additional weight and going up instead of constantly going out, like so many towns and cities in Australia seem intent on doing.
Yeah, so just to clarify, so if any of those buildings are concrete tiled roofs and say it's 2 apartments underneath, they generally take more weight off than put it on in regards to the actual lightweight construction that's been put through. But just overseas, the council members are generally the largest airspace developers, funny enough. They're the ones creating the affordable housing and social housing above their existing buildings, as well as the affordable blocks. So they, funny enough, are the ones that are pushing this the most overseas than anyone, because they can literally cookie cutter, put a box on top, and you can imagine that it's far cheaper to buy the airspace above a building than it is to buy land. And of course, land is very much taxed. So yes, so the council, as soon as they become aware, but to be completely honest with you, most people I talk to in Australia about airspace have never heard of it before. They may have had inklings to it, but all I'm suggesting is that we don't need to know everything right now, but start asking the questions and just saying, hey, okay, we've got this really big capital works coming up. We can't afford it. How are we going to make this kind of conclude? Have we thought about selling the roof space? And at least ask some of the professionals, being it structural engineers, town planners, council, or lawyers, what is the opportunity, opposed to we're all going to have to sell out, we can't afford the maintenance of this building. So it's really just providing another opportunity to be able to pay for capital works.
I think it's fantastic. I'm going to have to go. I've got an AGM coming up in 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Thanks,
Thank
Greg.
you. Thanks, everybody. Fantastic, Warren. I just love it. You
Great.
need to speak to Ballarat Council.
Great.
Warren,
Send me a
you.
plane ticket.
in terms of the National Construction Code, because you're now potentially pushing into a point where you move from one class of building to another class of building, what's the position from your perspective about the NCC requirements? Or is this something that the Australian Building Code Board really has to turn its mind to and develop a new set of standards?
Well, no, it's far simpler. It's actually considered alts and adds. So when a building actually puts in alts and adds through council, that's exactly the pathway we go down. The NCC does get affected, where if you obviously going from 3 to 4 levels, you're having to do additional fire requirements. But primarily, the whole focus of doing the airspace works is to bring the fire and compliancy of NCC up. So
Right.
yes, you may need to spend additional monies on the building in regards to wiring, connections, fire upgrades as well. So it really gives a great opportunity to audit a building and say whether or not you can build up. We need to bring all these other facets up with it. So from a council perspective, they should be glad that there's some form of audit going through and some way to fund, because ultimately airspace development is a self-funding model. So we're providing homes create capital creates the fixing up of our buildings. Therefore, we can actually get a better living environment for our strata owners. But yes, there's going to need to be some tweaks, but it's as simple as adds and odds that the application through council anyway.
Warren, I just have a question, two comments. One is that you mentioned tendering to developers, and I'm very conscious that in New South Wales they have legislated around an iCert program. And so when you're in New South Wales, I presume that tendering that you would go to would be iCert developers.
Absolutely.
Yes, you would. Yes, absolutely. So now in Victoria, we haven't legislated that, but from what I understand, the iCert program is available nationally.
It is.
That it's actually a certification project, a platform that any developer could sign up to. So does that mean, and I don't know how many are on it in Victoria, for example, or Western Australia. Catherine, I don't know if you were aware of that, but would that mean that a priority in terms of your tendering process, would there be a priority given to the iCert if they were carrying that certification to, first of all, for that quality, to give our lot owners some kind of assuredness that is not there through the through the building process currently. So is that how you would tackle that? Like how when we, that's our biggest fear in anything that we go into, whether we're putting solar panels, whether we're putting EV in, is trust in that, the actual supplier at the end of the day in doing something that's not going to give us another headache.
Absolutely, and you'd consider it to be any remedial builder type scenario where they're going to be coming through and fixing up your building, doing walls, doors, and you'd be going through the same due diligence to ensure that that particular supplier is. iCert is the only way to go. It's the only people that I use or work with or allow to tender on any space that we do. But the owners corporation need to be confident, very similar to that of their general upkeeping, to obviously choose someone that goes up. But the beauty is that the owners are very conscious about providing a good quality service because it's their own asset. However, we get developers here that buy everybody out, knock it down, create their own rules, build it up, and we get defects to deal with. And we're only really dealing with the developers after the fact, where what's quite good about airspace is that the owners are actually selecting who works on their building opposed to buying them out and building up.
Okay. And I presume the people who already reside in the building, they live through this process?
They do, and the purpose of the modular and prefab is to make it really quick. So to give you the average airspace home in London is delivered in under 3 days. So yes, they do spend time
Wow.
preparing the area. But the whole point is to get people so they're not working at height. It's dangerous for obviously for carpenters and the likes to be working on rooftops. We don't want the weather to come through and soak the building. So really it's a kind of a surgical type process. And it doesn't have to be prefabbed as in a box. We can create the walls and put the jigsaw puzzle together up on the roof. But we're just minimizing something that would normally take 12 months down to days, because most of the thinking and the planning and the building have been done elsewhere, and therefore the lot owners don't have to live through the noise and the clutter and the banging and the trucks and the traffic and all the likes. They actually can just be living there, and then for a short period of time there's an inconvenience, yes, but primarily most buildings are doing quite a lot of other work to them at the same time. If you're doing
Yes.
an airspace development, you know, they got $1 million now for their roof space, and that's just an average 3, 4, 5 apartment building. I mean, your average building in Bondi's rooftop is worth close on $1 million. So they're going to be using that money to fix up their building. So yes, the building's going to be generally could be a construction site, but that's not because of the airspace part. It's because they're needing to do large capital works to it anyway. So it's not adding to it, if you know what I mean. While they're doing all those other works, we can pop something on the roof as well. But primarily we're looking for buildings that require capital works to them so that we can obviously fund those through the airspace.
Okay, so it seems from our conversation that we're looking for buildings that are typically 1930 to 1950 or 60, that are the double brick construction. They're walk up, so they're effectively 2, 3 and 4 story apartment buildings. Tiled roof. Not that they had to be tiled, but tiled roof, as you say, a pitched roof, it gives us the opportunity to go into airspace that is already being occupied. So it's not changing the overall height of the building by very much, where it is already a pitched roof, because that void is not being used. Yeah, and it is that funding mechanism, as you say. So a building that is looking to move obviously to electric, which is every building, so but needs other work to be done, be, as you say, brick ties and rusted windows, concrete cancer, various things like that. They're prime subjects.
They definitely the low-lying fruit. So they generally, the older buildings requiring more major capital works to them. Therefore, the incentive to do an airspace development is that much larger.
Yes.
Airspace works perfectly for the newer strata blocks as well. It's just they generally don't have as large a capital works. Therefore, you know, they may not be as prone for this solution. But yes, even the modern ones with flat roofs are perfect because it's most of the work's been done already. It's just a case that you'll notice in the news lately that Brisbane Council, just the last couple of days, have pushed up their height requirements, allowances. Same in Sydney. So councils realise that we need 1 million new homes to be built in Australia. My true focus is to push airspace because it's the greenest. Presently, our construction industry create 40% of our carbon emissions and over 20 million tons of rubbish. So at least by not knocking buildings down, using what we've got and building up on top, we can actually save the planet and keep our communities living in the buildings that they've grown up in.
So here in Victoria, to sell off the airspace, which is selling off common property now, that would be a unanimous resolution for us still. And I'm not sure, Catherine, for you, whether you've shifted on the sale of common property, the level of resolution, but in New South Wales and Queensland is about to.
Sorry, yes, it is definitely, it's definitely unanimous here.
Still for you too,
but
yeah.
what's the alternative? What's the alternative? Everyone having to find 30 grand or 50 grand to pay for the upgrades.
Yeah,
I think
there may be,
it's a no-brainer. Yeah.
For selling to a developer the whole block, for example, it's definitely a barrier, which is why New South Wales a lower threshold to allow the total termination of the scheme. So, Warren, do you know in New South Wales then, is that selling off the common property a reduced threshold, meaning 75% for that, or are they also unanimous resolution?
75%.
Right. Okay.
Same with Queensland is Victoria, sadly, but still we'll get there. But primarily, it's where the body corporate has a huge bill to pay. Not only does that get fixed because they're not having to replace their roof, but they actually get money from it as well. So it's a double bonus in the fact that it creates income, fixes the expenses, and does that all in a environmentally friendly process.
Well, the most important thing is they don't have to leave where they love to live, which is the problem with the developer, with the termination of scheme, is that they have to actually give up where they are and find somewhere else to live. And people choose to live where they live because of, the location, their community. So that's why there's such resistance to, regardless of the cost at the end of the day, it's that connection to community that is the hardest thing to give up. Whereas here, they don't. The motivation simply does become that vehicle for funding and leaving me to be able to stay where I love living. That kind of. So the motivation is different. We probably would have a much better chance of getting a unanimous resolution to sell off airspace purely for that reason.
Yeah. And that's why it's so big elsewhere in the world. We have all these NIMBYs and YIMBYs. The NIMBYs don't want to be affected by big developments, where this way they can actually contribute to the housing crisis and stay living where they are. So you can see why London, New York, all these other places have all these beautiful buildings and everyone's still living there wanting to go. Appreciate we need more houses, but they're not going to move. Then at least this is an opportunity that they can actually stay living and actually build up as well.
And just one final one, just wrapping up, the communication towers and equipment that is unwanted on our buildings, but we can't prevent from going on our buildings, are now in the way of, let's say, doing this kind of thing. Have you dealt with that on buildings already, or have they not been tall enough that they've been, subject to, like, certainly billboards and all sorts of things are attached to, on rooftops? And it's more, the question is more about, like, have you dealt with it? But do they have to get it out of the way? I mean, we didn't want them there in the first place, and they're taking up valuable real estate. Can we now say to them, get out so we can do this development at their cost? Because why should we be paying the bill when we didn't want them in the first place? Did I say that too many times?
No one wants to pay. But primarily, looking at less than 3% of all buildings, strata buildings, have any form of additional requirements up in the roof regarding antennas and the likes. But yes, we're going to have to share our airspace. Primarily, it's going to come down to drone delivery. It's going to come through to air taxis. And I know this seems so futuristic, but however, next year in Paris, they're going to have the drones delivering people to in between. So it's just something that the towers have been the only people on the block when it comes to airspace. Now we're going to be pushing and barging to say, look, we can actually make more money from an airspace development than we can pay for your telecommunication tower. And look, I do see a lot of the changing in airspace and the fact that a lot of satellite requirements are coming through, and we're not needing as many aerials as we used to. So there is also a progression in infrastructure as well. But remembering that once we build up on the roof, there's always a roof to the roof. So we can always put the antennas on the roof of the airspace development as well.
Yeah. We just want to get rid of them altogether.
Oh, look, very cool. But look, I also want to just very quickly, while I had you, is it doesn't have to be a penthouse, doesn't have to be, units. It can be a green communal area.
Yeah.
Very similar to what's behind me here. It's a social area. People can use it from work from home type locations. They can get some good sun up there. We can collect rainwater, and it can be a communal area where owners can share their space and time, opposed to just being a building. So there's that two-prong approach. What's happening in London is they share it. There's a home, and then there's actually communal space up on the roof as well.
Mm-hmm.
Just going to jump in quickly and get Ray to ask his question. He's had his hand up for a long time. Ray, go for it.
I've been trying to say that. Ray, you've got your hand up.
Yes, I have. Especially in Melbourne, the outer suburbs, the councils still want one car space per apartment. And some of these places just don't have enough room. So that's going to cut out a lot of what you're thinking about here.
Well, yes and no. So all the actual statement of environmental effects that we're submitting with the application to council is ultimately providing a solution. So the solution generally is that we have some form of solar capacity on the roof that recharges a centralized battery for the building. And that actually recharges electronic EV cars on the curbside or within their parking lot, and creating a car sharing program where owners are happy to sell their cars and use a car share program, so therefore reducing their requirement for parking and giving up some of their requirement for parking as well. But primarily you'll notice with this whole push for a larger amount of homes, they're going to reduce the amount of car spaces required per block. And you'll see that work from council to council slowly but surely.
Yeah, it's already happening there, particularly if they're on railway lines, like close to public transport. There's a shift in how many car spots need to be delivered. They're actually allowing buildings to be built with only, say, 50% of the car parking, which is a nightmare from our perspective because everybody still has a car, but you know.
Well, that's true. But what's really great these days is the car sharing programs that we have. And it is going to reduce the amount of time. We are pushing for the 15-minute city where people can walk and trying to get rid of the roads. I know that's far down the track. But primarily councils are comfortable with amending that requirement if we provide a solution for the building.
Okay.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Great conversation and great contribution. Thank you, everyone, David and Catherine, for your questions, and our audience as well. Warren, thank you very much for coming on and sharing this great initiative. It's certainly for those what are mostly suburban buildings now. I think that is a real understanding this whole concept now. I think Catherine, are you poised to look at 4-story walk-up now buildings, and got that in your being the first to do it in Western Australia? Or
Oh my God, my brain is exploded, and I'm off looking immediately.
Me too.
We don't have as much our older stock here, but yes, I'll be going.
Interesting. Well, thank you everybody for joining in and listening to our podcast. Our next one will be on the 6th of October, so watch out for our advertising on the website, social media, and we will connect and see you soon. Thank
Cheers,
you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye for now.
Cheers.